Welcome, everyone. I'm Stephen Henry Madoff, the chair of the Masters in Curatorial Practice here at the School of Visual Arts in New York. Each week, we have a distinguished curator or director to speak in the curatorial roundtable from somewhere in the world. And today it's Margot Norton. I'm just going to go through a few technical things and we will begin with Margot. So first, we'll talk for about 25 minutes. There could be a break. We'll go for a total of about 50 minutes. Then it's time for you to put in your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and Margot will answer. And we'll go for about an hour. So I'm just going to read a short bio for Margot, and that is Margot Norton is Chief Curator at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, where she leads the curatorial team and oversees the exhibition program. Margot was previously Alan and Lola Goldring Senior Curator at the New Museum in New York, where she co-curated the 2021 New Museum Triennial Softwater Hard Stone, other exhibitions that Margot has done, and the list is very long. So I'm just going to note a couple of others. The show Wengeche Mutu, Intertwined, Pepón Osorio, My Beating Heart, Mi Corazón Latiente. At the museum, she's curated a lot of monographic shows. And again, the list is too long to read, along with group exhibitions, including The Keeper here and elsewhere in New York, NYC 1993, Experimental Jet Set Trash and No Star. In 2017, she curated the 8th Sequences Real-Time Art Festival in Reykjavik, Iceland, and the Georgian Pavilion at the 2019 Venice Biennale with artist Anna K.E. She also serves on the editorial council of Museums Moving Forward, an intergenerational, cross-institutional coalition of art museum professionals committed to advancing equity across the museum field. And before joining the New Museum in 2011, Margot was a curatorial assistant at the Whitney Museum. She's contributed to and edited numerous publications and exhibition catalogs and regularly lectures on contemporary art and curating. And with that, I am going to hand things over. Welcome, Margot.
Thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you all for joining today. I'm going to share my screen and share this presentation I've put together. Yeah, so there's just my biographic information. I am currently in Berkeley, California. I just moved here about 7 months ago from New York City, where I was living my entire life. I was born in New York and raised there, and worked, as Stephen mentioned, at the Whitney Museum and New Museum for about 12 years before starting here in Berkeley. And also, as Stephen mentioned, I curated a lot of shows at New Museum, about 40 shows actually. And a lot of monographic shows, but also collaborated with colleagues on group exhibitions. And I thought I would begin speaking about the 2021 New Museum Triennial, which I also refer to as the best collaboration of my life, with a co-curator, Jamila James, who is now a senior curator at the MCA Chicago. She was actually in LA as a senior curator at the ICA in LA at the time. And we worked together with 2 curatorial fellows and just a world of, colleagues and people across the globe to mount the exhibition and to research the exhibition. This is a picture of New Museum, which as New Yorkers, I'm sure you all are familiar with, but just to kind of
Margot, for some reason, I'm only seeing the very top of the screen. Try again, since we tested it before and it worked perfectly. There we go. Okay, now it's working. Great.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So sorry about that. Again, this is a picture of New Museum, where I was a curator for 12 years. I actually started off as assistant curator and then was promoted several times to a senior curator when I left and came here to Berkeley, where I'm now chief curator. So this is a little bit about the exhibition. And some of you might know the New Museum Triennial is a signature exhibition of the New Museum, which is dedicated to showcasing the work of emerging artists internationally. It is actually the only exhibition of its kind in New York, where we have the very well-known Whitney Biennial, which is dedicated to art from artists from the US or connected to the US in some way. And also the Greater New York exhibition, which is focusing on artists locally in New York City at PS1, MoMA PS1 in New York. But the triennial, I think, is unique in that every time I had seen a triennial, even before I worked on one, or even before I started at New Museum, it was always a place where I felt like I was seeing the work of artists that I didn't know. I was learning something new, and I was capturing a kind of zeitgeist in terms of what artists were thinking about at that time on an international level. So it is a very daunting, but also very exciting challenge to curate an exhibition of this scale. And, just this idea of presenting an exhibition of what artists are thinking about across the globe. But it's also a challenge that Jamila and I were really excited to pursue, and to also, think about also this, understandable futility that comes with these kind of survey exhibitions that are assembling artists from many different places throughout the world. And our approach to the research for the triennial was one where, when we were appointed curators about 3 years before the show took place, we really wanted to think about how we could do the research, do visits with artists, but not necessarily have a theme in mind in the beginning, and to let that theme emerge out of the research process. So approaching it almost like sponges, if you will, or like on our visits, we would just talk to each other and think about what it was that these artists were thinking about that maybe had cross currents with something that was happening, on a kind of more, general level, kind of politically or economically, or thinking about how these things resonated with current events. And also how artists were addressing things that we felt were really, indicative of the moment that we were living in. So one important point about our research was, often for these kind of exhibitions, the locations where curators can go are dictated by what countries can support their travel, which was something that we were very much aware of. And myself, having worked at New Museum for a long time and seeing how the other curators had approached the research for the exhibition, I knew that it was imperative that we fundraise specifically in order to visit places that were kind of off the art world beaten path, if you will, because there's so many artists that are working in places around the world that don't necessarily have gallery representation, perhaps don't have biennials or major international exhibitions or art fairs that bring curators in. So we organized our travel by thinking about where we could go that would really make an impact. And I mean, there's so many places too where the artists don't have web presences. It's almost impossible to research their work online. So we also wanted to think about that as well. An important point to note is this is the 2021 New Museum Triennial. So our research was during the pandemic, kind of before and after. So we started off doing a lot of physical travel. I think we revisited over like 50 cities in 20 countries, 5 continents. It was really robust amount of travel that we did. And I even remember thinking right before the pandemic hit about like my workload working on exhibitions at the museum and the amount of travel I was doing at that time, thinking, how can this continue? And then it didn't. We were then kind of our whole research had to change to Zoom conversations with artists. And we did have a bunch of trips lined up, but instead of going and researching them physically, we did them online, which also, was, I feel like we saw so many more artists almost than we would have if we were physically there. And it did kind of expand our research, but of course there's certain limitations to the virtual studio visit than the in-person visit. But for the most part, we had about a year and a half of physical travel before the pandemic took place. And just while we're staring at this, this title of the show, I thought I could give a little bit of an overview of how that title and that theme came about. So Soft Water Hard Stone was something that I heard on a studio visit with an artist named Gabriela Mereb. This was in person, so before the pandemic hit, in August of 2019. And I was visiting artists in Brazil at the time on a big trip there. And I visited Gabriela in Rio. She's one of the artists that's included in the exhibition. And she was telling me about a work of hers that was informed by a very popular proverb: soft water on hard stone hits until it bores a hole. And she translated this from the Portuguese: água mole emperadora tanto bate ate que fura. And she also hinted at the fact that this has two translations, or two kind of meanings that are associated with it. One, which is about this idea of perseverance or resistance, even this idea that if you preserve long enough, the desired effect will eventually be achieved. Something similar to the saying that I feel like we use a lot in the US, like small strokes fell big oaks, something like that. And then the second one was this fact that time could destroy even the most perceptibly solid material. So this idea of inevitable impermanence, something that I feel like we all had a deep lesson in during the pandemic. But even prior to the pandemic, it was something we were thinking a lot about, because it was almost as if we were at this moment where so many of the structures that we thought would last forever, whether they be government structures or institutional structures or structures that we almost like, unquestioningly believed in, were being revealed to be precarious or not working or on the verge of collapse and in need of revision or repair, if you will. And I think those terms were kind of buzzing about at that time. But it really felt like when the pandemic hit too, it was like this giant spotlight was ignited, and so much of what was swept into corners or under rugs were being exposed. And I feel like, this feels like a long time ago now, but it actually was fairly recent. And I still think the reverberations of what happened during that time, even prior to that time when, we were thinking about these themes, are still very present today. So this is the work by Gabriela Mereb that we spoke about that gave the show its title. I don't have video in this presentation, but if you can imagine, this is a small motor that's hitting a rock repeatedly. And the idea is that over time, the rock will eventually teeter and fall over, or that the rod will actually bore a hole inside of the rock and causing a kind of powder to come down. One of the things that we didn't anticipate in the exhibition was the sound of this work is so powerful. Because when I saw it in her studio, the floor that it was on didn't resound in such a profound way. But when it was installed in the new museum, it actually, Holland Cotter reviewed the exhibition at New Museum and called it the heartbeat of the exhibition, because it really did resound throughout the whole building. But Gabriela in general works with a lot of motors, a lot of things that are sourced from cars. She has training as a mechanic, and also would get a lot of different engines and parts and create these sculptures that are, I feel like, as much sound as they are sculpture. And then a few words about how we divided the exhibitions by floor. Something unique to the new museum, which you saw that image earlier, is that it is a museum that the architecture of which is very different than a typical museum, I think, that we're used to seeing, that has a lot of lateral space. The new museum has distinct floors that have all different heights of the ceilings to the width. So basically, the way that the architect Sanaa designed the museum is so that the volume on each of the floors is the same, so that the height of the ceilings is taller and then the width is smaller on each, and then it kind of grows almost like layers of a cake. And the bottom of the museum has the shortest ceilings and the widest floor print. And because of this, working with that building as I did for 12 years, 10 years at this point, I felt that it was really important to treat those floors as distinctive spaces, almost to create a different kind of feeling on each of the floors. So when we did assemble the artists for the exhibition, we wanted to recall a kind of different atmosphere in the installation. So on the top floor, which has the tallest ceilings, we were thinking a lot about almost having that floor resemble a sculpture garden or something that could allude to being outside. And that's the only floor that has the biggest skylights on the ceiling. So we wanted to allow as much natural light as possible into that space. And, you know, also I feel with the title of the exhibition, we did want to address, you know, obviously these ideas of impermanence, but also even located within the natural conditions like the daylight that exists outside, and kind of bring that into the space. I think it is something that, you know, kind of goes unnoticed, that we don't think about, you know, in terms of the light in museums or the ways that the artworks are displayed, but kind of bringing in natural elements into the institutional space was something that we wanted to think about a bit. And another aspect of the installation that was important to us was that we didn't build any walls for the show. And when we did have a separation in the space, it was an artwork that acted as a kind of architecture. And, you know, one thing that I did experience in working at New Museum, but also many, you know, different institutions, especially in New York City, was how often the architecture of the exhibition changes with these huge demolitions and rebuildings of walls throughout the shows, which are also oftentimes the most expensive thing on an exhibition budget, and also creates a lot of waste. So we were thinking about kind of the alternative ways that we can divide space or create different dialogues between works when an artist could design a type of wall that would divide spaces. So so the fourth floor was completely open, and then we had several works in that you could see here, which I'll speak about a little bit. One is Gabriel Chaile's sculpture, an artist that I'll speak about more in depth later, which was over 4 meters high, which was a work that he makes with clay, with adobe, a mixture of sawdust and clay, that was actually, it comes apart in several parts. I'll get more into that later. A work called Mama Luchona. I actually recently worked with Gabriel Chaile. He's an artist from Tucumán, Argentina, on an exhibition here in Berkeley. So I'll speak about his work in greater depth. In the foreground is Brandon Ndife, an artist who works a lot, kind of thinking about the relationship between the kind of architectural environment, the domestic environment, and the natural environment, you know, kind of coming in and taking over. These are all different kind of mass-produced furniture items like those found in IKEA, which are also incorporated with these forms that almost feel like, you know, they're decaying, growing and decaying simultaneously. So a theme that resonated throughout the show was this idea between the world, the kind of built environment, and the natural world, and those things also affecting one another, or even the way that we as animals are a kind of a part of this world that we might not necessarily recognize. And just the way that the kind of that our world and the world, the, you know, world of plants or animals, you know, this earth that we all inhabit is also affecting one another too, so that, you know, the environments that we create affect us, and, you know, vice versa, obviously how we affect the environment, things like climate change, etc. So you see in the background is a work by Cynthia Deno. Actually, I'm gonna get back to Erin, but this is her work. And they're paintings that she made. She's an artist based in Baltimore. She's done a lot of work in this kind of serial painting tradition. That's a lot of it is addressing US history. And so these are all paintings of witness trees, which are trees that are kind of over 500 years old, landmark trees, especially in the US, like in and around Baltimore, that witnessed the Civil War in the United States. And so there are these very beautiful kind of dapplings of light. And, you know, she went to the sites where these trees exist and painted them. But also, you know, they seem quite bucolic, but they are also kind of subject to all of the kind of bloodshed, racist bloodshed that existed also in US history. And so it was kind of a profound moment, you know, to kind of see these works and then also to understand, you know, everything that these trees have seen. And then kind of going back, this is Erin Jane Nelson, who's an artist from Atlanta, Georgia, who creates a lot of works kind of thinking about the planet and the kind of ever-changing ecology, also thinking a lot about the kind of terrestrial and celestial worlds. And in a lot of these works, like this one is called A Gut, a Lake, a Cell, a Sky. She was thinking about this like almost kind of like microbial pattern, also resembling like celestial ones. And then everything here is in ceramic, but she also has photographs that are kind of embedded in the glazes. And they're also often representing different kinds of fungi or mushrooms, or and then even plants that she incorporates into the glazes of these works too. That kind of create this interesting juxtaposition between what is made and what is found. And something that I think is really beautiful about these works, and the kind of installation that she made, but also the ways that a lot of artists were working in the exhibition, is how they kind of feel simultaneously intimate and monumental. There was like, they took up a very big wall of the exhibition floor, but also when you get close, you're really rewarded by all the details inside of them. This is a work by Janine Freyne-Jutli, who's Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation artist based in Whitehorse in Yukon, Canada. And she has created this piece with tiny little beads. You can see some more images here. So it was our task to get this giant crate of beads. She actually, the crate of beads was the body weight of the artist. And then what we needed to do was kind of up to the curators to do, was to install this work anywhere in the museum that we wanted. So we put it kind of in all of the cracks of the floor, also like against walls and into corners. And it's a really beautiful piece because there's also this situation that happens with it where at the end of the exhibition, it's actually going to have less beads than in the beginning. People might step on it and find a bead in their shoe months later. And also kind of addresses this idea of an artwork and even of a person, and this relationship to loss that exists with it when it's shown, when it's experienced the world, when it's embedded within the fabric of the institution, when it is also in the ground that we walk upon without necessarily recognizing that it's there. And then moving down to the third floor, we changed the environment completely. So this floor had very low lighting. And one of the things that we really wanted to address here was that relationship between the built environment and the human body. So we have work by Kate Cooper on the wall, which was actually a kind of an X-ray that she developed in CG, which was like kind of looking into the inner workings of the body, but very much related to this idea of the body as a machine. And then Krista Clark, who has the work on the right, where Krista is also an artist from Atlanta, Georgia. And she was making these works that were addressing the kind of explosion of urban development that was happening in Atlanta, which of course we can, and New Yorkers can relate to very much, actually even here in Berkeley, California. But all of these projects that were also unfinished, all these buildings that were being built that were just kind of existing in this precarious state. And so she was kind of struck by the kind of almost violent aspects of these environments that, you know, it had all these wires and light bulbs exposed. And this is specifically, alluding to, in a very poetic way, this idea of displacement with the tent that exists kind of perched on top of a concrete structure, and the amount of people that are displaced by certain gentrification projects, and also just like the weight of these materials and their juxtaposition with something quite light. So this is all cast concrete. And then she also created this kind of almost soft, corporal quality with the fiberglass, which also looks very inviting, but is actually contains tiny glass particles that are very dangerous to touch. This is more images of the third floor of the exhibition, which is also thinking about this relationship between the human body and the built environment, with this painting by Ambera Wellman in the background, and in the foreground, a sculpture by an artist named Yu Ji. These are some details of Ambera's piece. It was amazing to see this work in progress because it changed every single time I saw it. But her work, she created this kind of history painting, very panoramic. Actually, at the time, it was the largest painting the New Museum ever exhibited. Was about like 40 feet long. And this work had all of these different scenes in it of destruction, but also a kind of like, love and I don't like a kind of resistance amidst the destruction. In the center of the painting was this giant sink. So it was like this idea of like the sink kind of swallowing everything happening in the world, but all of these kind of volcanoes and, disasters taking place while people kind of continued to dance or be involved in these, erotic activities, but with their bodies kind of intertwining so that there was a lack of separation between them. And then this is Yu Ji, who at the time was building all of these works called Flesh and Stone, which were taking different bodily fragments alongside things that she would source in the surroundings. This work was actually made for an exhibition she had in London, where she sourced a lot of material from construction sites that she would find to create these tables and these kind of plaster casts of bodies that are also kind of merging with one another in a way that echoes Ambera's work. So you see here all of the rubble and debris that she found on the street incorporated into the sculpture itself. This is a work by Lotus Lori Kong, who was making these works at the time with these flexible studs. So again, another work that was resembling a wall-like structure, but also has this way that it feels like guts that are kind of spilling out, like outside of the skeleton of the wall. And so it also incorporated the kind of skins on top of the walls were actually photosensitive paper that she exposed to different lights levels in her windows of her studio. And then when they made their way into the new museum, they continued to change over the course of the exhibition. So it was quite profound for us to have a work in the show that would change and kind of fade throughout the exhibition. Also kind of acknowledging the ways that everything is changing, even throughout the course of the 3-4 months that the exhibition was on view. This is the back side of that wall. And on this, she was incorporating different photographs that she made, also using her studio light, but with this almost like porous quality to the images themselves. And then next to her is an artist named Harry Goldharvey IV, who's an artist from Fall River, Massachusetts, that works a lot with these are like job site heaters and these kind of drawings that are addressing a lot of the decay that has happened around that area in Fall River, this kind of post-industrial town. He actually repurposes all of the wood for his work from mansions, former mansions, some of which have burned down, some of which are abandoned around that area in Newport, Massachusetts, and Fall River, kind of addressing the ways that the industry there has also failed. There's some details of Lori's wall. This is an artist, Sandra Mujinga. Her work is actually, this piece is currently on view at the Guggenheim because it's incorporated in the exhibition Going Dark that's on there. So I encourage you all to go and check it out. It was also in the triennial. We commissioned her to create this work for the show. I don't have the video of it here, but it's these kind of hooded figures that kind of go in and out of visibility. Actually, a very important aspect of this work is it's almost impossible to be photographed. And Sandra is an artist from the Democratic Republic of the Congo who was based in Norway at the time. And in Norway, she described this experience that she had of being hyper visible and invisible simultaneously as a Black artist living in Oslo. And though she's also a musician and a composer, so she created a kind of soundtrack for the work. And this dancer is taking this hood, which has all of these kind of reflective aspects of it, and is kind of going in and out between the three screens in a way that's almost dodging the viewer's, eyes. Here's some more bad images of it. And then on the second floor of the exhibition, we wanted to actually focus on institutions and museums and kind of thinking about museological display in a different way. And we invited a lot of artists that we felt were also thinking about all of the detritus or the kind of remnants, if you will, of the environments that we create and how they're repurposing these objects to also give them a new life or kind of change what our perceived ideas are of value when it comes to art objects. And this was a painter named Christina Patali'i, who is an artist of Samoan descent based in New Zealand, who started creating these paintings on drop cloths. Her family are house painters, and she would actually go with them to work and start making these paintings during the process of house painting. So you can kind of see all the kind of drop cloth seams in the work. But she also was always interested in the history of art, of modernism. So a lot of what she incorporates in her works kind of resemble modernist tropes or shapes and structures, but she also created this thinking about a rugby boot. So she kind of plays with this idea kind of between modernism and the ways that herself and her own culture and pop culture and the, kind of things that exist around the, kind of typical art historical language or framework kind of exist around and through it. So that's her work. And then Khalil Robert Irving, another artist in the exhibition, who makes these works entirely in ceramic. It's kind of amazing to see what he can do with these image transfers onto the materials, some of which really seem like this vase in the background, like something that was found, but is actually something that he completely constructed. So he's thinking a lot about kind of playing with these ideas between what he can do with the material to resemble something organic, something, that resembles some kind of like, porcelain or like something from another time, or something that is very, typical of our current environment, like these images that he sources from the internet that he overlays on top of the work itself. And then the last floor of the triennial is the lobby gallery. And here we created this environment for a piece by Amy Lien and Enzo Camacho, who are a duo. Actually, one is based in New York and the other in the Philippines. But they create a lot of pieces in collaboration. And this was a work they made during the pandemic, where they actually kept all of their like skins of fruits and vegetables and other types of materials that they would source from, ordering in food online or, whatever they were doing, and kind of sequestered in their homes in various ends of the earth. And then they created these casts with the materials that they had of these heads of a sculpture. This work was originally commissioned for the Manifesta in Marseille, another exhibition there in France. And they noted that when they arrived in Marseille, they came to the train station there and saw two allegorical sculptures, one on one end that was meant to represent an allegory of Asia, and the other one on the other side that was meant to represent an allegory of Africa. And like these types of colonial sculptures, they represented women and had all of these different kind of fruits and riches that were sourced from their colonial conquests around them, and they kind of transformed the head of the figure that was representing the allegory of Asia into these 5 different figures that were kind of transformed into a kind of deity called the Mangyal, which is also a deity that references a lot of destruction or these kind of cycles of decay and rebirth. And it has, each one represents a different organ. And there's a soundtrack that's actually coming in the background where you hear different sounds that were happening in the artist's homes, bats running, but also like the protests that were happening for Black Lives Matter outside of, Amy's apartment in New York. So there was also this kind of atmosphere to it where the works would light up and change with the soundtrack that was added to it. And then the last work in the exhibition is Samara Scott. There's many more works, but this is just a selection for lack of more time. And this was a work that Samara made with a lot of latex and pigments, but also all of these little objects that she found in the street. So things like cigarette butts, and you see a lighter here, but also jewelry items, some fruits and vegetables. There's some details in this image, but it really was one of those pieces like Erin Jane Nelson that rewarded a kind of close examination. I think another aspect of this exhibition was that Jamila and I were working online for the majority of the research for the show. So it was important to create a show that also felt very tactile. There was something that we were felt like we were lacking in terms of this relationship between the art object and the person, or this kind of visceral and very powerful way that an encounter with an art object can be. So you can see a lot of that in this exhibition as well. And then that's the kind of painting that she created on the facade of the museum that you would step through to enter the museum, also kind of bringing the outside inside, and also creating something that's quite like abstract and at times almost, abject, but also quite beautiful simultaneously. And then we created a really big book for the show. So I included that here. But it was important to us to create a book that really felt like a lasting document of the exhibition, because it was the Omicron variant at the time of the exhibition's opening. And so few people were really able to travel to see the show. Actually, we had almost like over 2/3 of the artists present. But it was thanks to our curatorial fellow, who was a master ESTA and Visa genius, who was able to get the artist to come, because the travel ban was in Europe at the time, so it was really difficult to do that. And so anyway, so in the book we actually incorporated 40 interviews with all of the artists in the exhibition, and each one of them got to choose who it was that interviewed them. So some of them were renowned artists, like Joan Jonas did one, Camille Enroe did another one, and others were friends of theirs or curators they've worked with in the past. Sometimes we did a few, and our team, also other curators at the museum did some, or educators, other people that they were close to. And so that was also important for us to incorporate the artists' voices themselves inside the exhibition catalog, because often for triennial books, you have these blurbs that describe the work, but rarely do you really have an opportunity to hear from the artist directly. And I feel that every book that I read that's an exhibition catalog, I want to hear from the artist first. So that's one of the reasons that we did that. I'm going to speak about two more shows briefly. One is the festival I curated in Iceland, because I sent that text to you all, and I wanted to briefly address that. My relationship with Iceland actually started off because I did a show with an artist from Iceland named Ragnar Kjartansson at New Museum, which was a solo show of his work. And we became friends, and his wife was actually on the board of a festival in Iceland and invited me to curate a festival there. And that was such an amazing opportunity for me too, as a curator, because at that time I was working, collaboratively on group exhibitions, but I had yet to really work on a group exhibition of my own. And it kind of started out in 2016 because they invited me first to curate a show for television. So I created this show called Night Transmissions Electronic Intimacy, which was a show that was given the kind of framework or space of midnight to 7 a.m. on the most popular television station in Iceland for 2 weeks. And so I just decided to think about this relationship between the television and the home as something very intimate, something that's in your domestic environment, is with you perhaps as you are drifting in and out of dreams, or kind of able to manipulate your senses, and this idea of it being like almost another family member in the space with you. So all of the works incorporated in this exhibition for television were kind of thinking about those themes. This is a work, a very well-known work called Gross Fatigue by an artist named Camille Enroe, which is very much addressing this relationship between screens and our own bodies and the ways that we navigate the world. And then the festival that they invited me for was a year after that, which was called, it's called the Sequences Art Festival, and they call it a real-time art festival. And when they invited me to do this project, I love this idea of real time that they addressed, and kind of juxtapose it with this idea of unreal time, right? Like what does that even mean? And I was reading a lot of Halldór Laxness too, kind of in my research about Iceland, who spoke about this idea of time being the one thing that we can all agree to call supernatural, in terms of what it means. And I think in that text I incorporated this quote, but was thinking about artists that manipulate time as a raw material, and also this experience in Iceland where the daylight shifts so dramatically. I think at the point when I curated the festival in October, it shifted 1 hour in difference of a shorter day at the end of the week than it did at the beginning of the week. So when time can feel so palpable, when we can also like kind of recognize our position on a planet rotating its course around the sun, we become, I think, accustomed to a different experience of time than the one that, our systems generate, right? This idea of synchronicity that we have across the world in terms of our clocks and the way that we think about, showing up on time or being somewhere that everybody can understand where you are. And so the works in the exhibition were very much addressing that idea. And so this is a painter, actually, Birger Andresen, who we commissioned to do a mural in the exhibition. He makes different colors that are addressing different qualities of light in Iceland in particular, because he's a local artist there. And so this is a work called The Infinite Day. And in the summer in Iceland, it is like entirely daytime. So even when it is nighttime, it has this distinctive color of blue that is a little bit darker than the entire daylight. But it's this idea also of, like kind of stretching days or stretching nights. And Joan Jonas was the honorary artist of the festival. So we invited her to perform Moving Off the Land, which was a work that she was currently developing that she later presented at the Tate in London the next year. But Iceland has been a major influence in a lot of works by Joan Jonas. And having known that, I invited her to participate in the festival with a performance and also a major exhibition. So this is a view of her exhibition that we had at the Living Art Museum in Reykjavik. And the exhibition itself kind of took place over the entirety of the city. So we were able to use a lot of different spaces, which was really an honor. Spaces like museums, but also more unconventional spaces. This is a work by David Horvitz called Let Us Keep Our Own Noon, which exists of, I think it's 47 church bells, but they're all made by melting down a larger church bell that he got from a church that was abandoned, and then melted it into these small component parts. So I was thinking about the ways that we share time, or the ways of dividing time. and the way that the exhibition took place is, I mean, that the project took place is that we would invite the public to come get a bell and then walk around the city of Reykjavik when it was high noon. So that changed every single day, 107, 108, whatever. It was always a different time. And then the idea was to ring the bell around the town and bring it back whenever you wanted. So it was this idea of kind of owning time or taking time with you as you went along. This is another work of his. I'm particularly inspired by this poster that he made, a clock that is wound by the wind, because on the top of the of Reykjavik, there's this giant church with a big clock that's literally wound by the wind all the time, and you can never trust it because it tells a different time every time you look at it. But yeah, kind of thinking about these alternative ways of making clocks or measuring time. And then he wheat pasted them all over the city. This is another performance that he led, but then so many artists involved in the festival were also musicians. So they together played these hourglasses that incorporated seawater inside of them, and then was kind of thinking about the ways that time also has a kind of sonic component, and kind of lingers in this kind of pitch that you hear when you're running your hand around the ring of a glass with water. Another artist, Ragnar Helgi Olafsson, played a work that he actually placed different microphones around the world. So he recorded the sound of daybreak, and the work actually also played, and he just worked with different friends of his at different cities. So the work played the sound of daybreak as it moved throughout the world, and it was a live stream of the sounds. This is another work that he made that were these calendars where people just were able to write on them. Actually, the one on the left is a writer named Anne Carson, who was in a residence in Iceland, and she wrote this one that says busy, 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 busy. Then Roman Ondak did a performance called Lightness of Being, which is a type of performance. It's a very simple gesture, but it's basically taking a group of people and arranging them by age, and then they together kind of walk throughout the city. And so, yeah, kind of thinking about, time is something quite physical and sculptural inside of people's bodies. And this was actually one whole family. So it was the first time that he did it that way. But in Iceland, there's, these very large families, and this one was very sweet, and they came and performed this piece. Eduardo Navarro, who's an artist from Argentina, came and did this work called In Collaboration with the Sun. We worked together with a local choreographer, and they developed a choreography around the locations of the sun at different times of day. And for weeks, they were rehearsing this piece. And then, of course, at the opening of the exhibition, it was very cloudy and there was no sun. And so Eduardo just instructed the dancers to just sit in the corner. So that's what they did. And it was actually quite a powerful moment because everybody was there and all the press for the opening, and they were wondering when people were going to do something, and they ended up not doing anything. Actually, this is Bjork. It's an amazing environment there because it's very small, and the art community there is very close. So there was just some really amazing people in the whole time that we were there in the festival. And this is Anna K.E., the artist that I worked with in the Georgian Pavilion in Venice, but actually before we did the Georgian Pavilion, and her partner Florian Meisenberg, who together created this work called Late Checkout. And they actually performed the piece in a hotel room. And it's kind of based on hotel rooms being this kind of vacuum where time kind of fades away, or locations fade away, or these rooms kind of resemble a hotel room in any place in the entire world. And so they do this kind of choreography with Florian with the camera, and Anna, who's a trained ballet dancer, kind of navigating the space in these very precarious movements, kind of on top of different ledges, and everyone piled into a hotel room to view them in a hotel room next door. And the last artist that I'm presenting from this festival is Aki Sasamoto. And Aki was creating this performance about the idea of elasticity, which resonated a lot with ideas of elastic hours, but also created this kind of abacus here in this performance, together with these, they're like giant trash containers that she rolled into a museum space. So this took place in the Reykjavik Art Museum. They have this central kind of corridor where she performed this work. And that's another image of it here. And then the last piece is a very simple work by Alicia Quade, who's a Polish artist who created this clock that rotates with the hands don't rotate, but the outside of it does. So kind of playing with this idea of like things that we perceive and ways that we tell time, or ways that we tell where we are. And then I have one show to present at Berkeley. It's an artist that was in the triennial that I presented already. So you might remember Gabriel Chaile, who's an artist from Tucumán who works in these giant soaring clay sculptures. This is the work from the New Museum Triennial called Mama Luchona, which actually has eggs that are embedded inside of the adobe. And then this is a work that he did following the triennial in the Venice Biennial, the most recent one, where he created these giant clay ovens, basically. And he actually described this experience that he had as an indigenous artist growing up in Tucumán, where he made all of these clay ovens with adobe his whole life. And then when he went to art school, he didn't think about using this material in his art making, and was only kind of thinking about painting and sculpture in a more classical sense. And then had this aha moment where he realized that this material that he knew and actually knew how to manipulate very well in the clay ovens that he created was the material that he wanted to work with. So this is a kind of detail of one of those sculptures from Venice. And then he cooks in them. So this is still of an image. I actually visited him where his studio is now in Lisbon, Portugal. And he does kind of performances and happenings together with food, which he cooks inside the clay oven. So this is an image of the gathering that he had recently in Lisbon. And then this is a work that is up right now on the High Line in New York, which is called The Wind Blows Where It Wishes, and actually has a sound component so that when the wind comes in, it plays these different notes in this pipe that the figure is holding. It's actually quite interesting. I'm going to New York tomorrow, actually, and I'm excited to see what happens with it, because adobe is a material that it looks like it might be fired or sturdy, but is actually quite fragile. And so the High Line work itself is also changing. So he was kind of thinking about the natural elements being exposed to that work. And like adobe houses, you have to kind of continuously repair them and work on them, with changes in weather. And then here he is working in Berkeley. So one of the things that was such an honor for me when I landed here was this idea that I'm working now in a university, and how I could together work with the faculty and students at the university to use our resources to also teach students at the same time as also working together with an artist on an exhibition. So this is him actually talking to students about how he makes his work. And together they made this adobe mixture and they worked together to create it. When I first started here, the head of the art practice department, Ronald Rail, who also works in earth and architecture, was very excited about Gabriel coming and working together with students on creating the sculpture together, because they had also been studying clay ovens. And so we spent a lot of time, making this work in the studio space together with the students there, and then brought the works into the exhibition space where Gabriel further worked on them with his team. And here you can see him constructing it. There was clay everywhere. We tried really hard to keep it out of the rest of the museum, thankfully. And then here it is almost finished in the galleries. And that is it at the end when we exhibited it. So this is a work that he made, which is quite different than his other ones. You can see it has this almost fierce expression, but then there's this almost childlike figure that's at the top emerging from it like a kind of Russian nesting doll. So he was thinking a lot about the ways that the reverberations of history and time also kind of affect one another kind of through generations. He grew up in a lot of poverty because in Tucumán in Argentina, there was a military dictatorship in the 1960s, which the dictator at the time closed down all the sugar mills. His father actually worked in a sugar plantation, and so he was directly affected by this. Was thinking about all of the poverty that he grew up in and how that also kind of affected the entire environment that was in Tucumán. And actually, Tucumán was called the Garden of Argentina by the dictator, which was also the artist at the time mounted an exhibition in 1968 called Tucumán Arde, Tucumán is Burning, where they talked about it being the garden of poverty and a lot of a lot of the kind of ways that the government was covering up for what was happening then. So that you could see the title of the exhibition here painted, which is actually a phrase that Gabriel wrote down in his church notebook when he was a kid. And then he incorporated a lot of photographs in the exhibition. Sorry, these are images I just took from the website, but there's some more here. Here you can actually see inside of the sculpture for the first time ever. He always covers it up, but in this instance in the exhibition, he wanted to also reveal this kind of interior labor that it takes to create the work. And that's it. All right.
Great. All right, so we've got 3 questions, comments. Can you see them?
Yes.
All right, so I'm going to read them aloud so that the audience can know what we're talking about. So from Nat, not so much a question, but holy moly, Margot, the triennial is tremendous. How on earth did you manage to tackle the curatorial theme while COVID was happening, and at the same time select artists whose aesthetic or approach to materials may have changed during? So maybe there is a question. Fantastic. I love the idea of quote unquote fabricated decay as it relates to bodies in whatever form or unformed they take shape. Much success in your new role. So anything you want to say about that?
Thank you, Nat. And yeah, I think it's interesting. Materials did change throughout the course of the show. And yeah, things did evolve, but in a ways that I think the artists expected and they had also anticipated. So there wasn't anything that happened during the course of the show that I think went very far from what they wanted to do with the work. I'm always, and I'm continually fascinated with the role of museums in embracing the work of artists who embrace and but also even exalt the idea of impermanence in their work, because I think there's this kind of fabrication, if you will, of a museum kind of being something that's rooted in foreverness, or even this idea of a permanent collection. Like, what does that even mean when objects and institutions themselves are constantly shifting, right? So I think I'm very interested in those ideas, and I do I think that yeah, it was something that artists were exploring even pre-COVID, some of them. But actually, even since that time, I think this is even getting more profound in terms of how artists are working, or even bringing in natural materials into their work.
All right,
I hope that answers the question.
Next, from Leo Hopewell, being present with artists and their artwork seems very important in your work, but is there concern about the environmental impact of so much travel, especially seeing many of the pieces address our failing ecosystem?
100%, Leo, and thank you so much for that question. I think it's whenever you're doing a job that involves travel, right? I think it's important to think about how, when it's necessary to travel, and when it's not. And I think, in terms of the research for the triennial, even like being able to conduct so many of those studio visits remotely. I remember being in India and doing a studio visit with an artist that was literally him sitting at a computer and flipping through images. I didn't need to be with him in the room. That was basically the same thing, right? But I think that one of the things that we did do with our travel for the triennial, even before the pandemic happened, was consolidate the travel. So like when we went to North Africa, we spent a whole 2 weeks traveling internally. So we didn't want necessarily to do too many huge back and forth trips, but like think about how those trips can be consolidated. But I really do think that being in person with artists and artwork is necessary for this kind of work. I cannot imagine being able to do so many studio visits, also with language barriers, also with, the fact that a lot of these places don't have good Wi-Fi, or even thinking about like how we would be able to do that otherwise. So it's kind of a balance, if you will, between the necessity of being in person with artists and traveling and being able to do that, but then how to do it in a way that also is ecological. I do think, you know, for the Gabriel Chaillet exhibition too, that we just did here in Berkeley, Gabriel came, but the work didn't ship. Imagine all of what that carbon footprint would be if we shipped that entire piece, right? So I think we also were trying to find out a way to also think about ecology in terms of what it means to create a work in a place, knowing that, yeah, like how we need to work around this, but also kind of keeping in mind the necessity of certain kinds of travel for this work and why it's important to showcase the work of artists who don't necessarily have access to curators in New York, for example.
Great. Okay. Last, anonymous attendee. Tactility and touch seem to be very important throughout the shows you spoke about. Why is that? And have you seen shows devoted exclusively to this in art?
I think not only was tactility and touch important for the triennial exhibition that we did, but it was like for us as curators, but it was important for the artists. A lot of the artists actually we invited for the show didn't necessarily make work that was so tactile in the beginning, but then like it kind of went in that direction in some instances. I think that, yeah, we were all in this moment of just like screens. And so you could see that the word that came out of that was important. And, you know, I definitely feel that there's a kind of, you know, there's this idea I think that exists between materiality and conceptual work, right? There's like idea-based work and there's material-based work, but I'm also interested in the fact that within all materials, there is a conceptual framework. And even when you're thinking about adobe, there's so many layers of, you know, of history, of politics, of the reason that, you know, that kind of tactile expression in an artistic expression exists that also relate very much conceptually to its making. And so I think with the triennial and so many other exhibitions that I've worked on, I also like to think about the implications of material on a level beyond just the material itself. But other shows that have been devoted that, I don't know if I can think of a show that's specifically talking about materiality or touch. And actually, to be honest with you, I don't know if that's enough, because I feel that there's so much more to material than simply just the fact that it's tactile. I hope that helps.
All right. So with that, somebody asked about the video recording. I'm putting in chat that you can find the recordings. It usually takes about 2 weeks at our website, macp.sva.edu/events. So with that, Margot, thank you so much. And thanks to the audience. Please come back next week. You can see also what's coming up for the roundtable in the same place on our website. And Margot, we'll see you in a moment for the session with the students.
Sounds great. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone.
All right. Bye.